All right, guys, bang, bang. I've got Shervin here. I'm super excited to have this conversation.
Awesome.
So thanks so much for doing it.
Of course.
Let's start with your background. You were not born in the United States, and you've got a pretty cool story about how you came to the U.S. and eventually got into the technology and business world. So we just kind of start back from Iran and how you get to the U.S.
Absolutely. I'm a child of revolution and war. I remember bombs falling in Tehran as a 6-year-old. The bomb sirens going off, anti-aircraft shooting, red streaks in the sky. Everybody would go in the basement, with candles and the fear in people's eyes. My dad had to escape before us. And so that was a pretty, hard experience. I found out years later, we were just talking about our dads, and they're just they're the greatest generation. That they're so humble about what they've done, and they don't really talk about it. But my dad worked for the Shah, and he was head of radio and television for part of the country. And so he actually made some brave decisions, put foreign language broadcasts for embassies for people to know how to get out of the country. And he saved lives. I found out from people later, like in the last 10 years, people coming and saying, your dad helped us back in the day, in 79 and so on. And so he was put on the execution list by Khomeini, and he had to go underground and hide. And so we didn't see him. And then one night, there's a good story about karma, which I think a lot about. And he helped a friend of his from his hometown on the Caspian Sea, who was from a poor family, but a religious family. The guy came and he had holes in his shoes and asked him for a job, for help. And my dad gave him a job, with him. And then a couple years later, somebody fired the guy without telling my dad. And my dad found out, reinstated him, said, don't touch this guy. He's my guy. And that guy ended up being head of security for the airport. So it's like out of Argo, right? So he comes and he's like, reaches out to my mom and is like, your husband helped me a lot and I want to help. And she checked with him that it was safe. And then my dad got in touch and they met at column number 4 at the airport. And he walked them through security on the Air France flight to get out of there before he was going to be killed. Life became very real and dramatic, quickly. We didn't see him for 2 years. And then Iran Iraq War started, and then me and my mom and brother and sister got out and met him in Washington, D.C. and started over. We came with nothing. So it's really like an American dream story. We're so grateful to America. We're all American citizens. We love America, and we wouldn't have any opportunity without America. And I think given, it's very relevant in terms of, the immigrant story and welcoming immigrants to America who rejuvenate the American dream and help build the economy. A lot of the tech companies we know about, almost the majority are started by immigrants, and they create a lot of jobs and have a huge economic impact. So, that's how we started. And my parents really focused on education. And so I just went from English for speakers of other languages. I didn't know any English. And then to gifted and talented, then to a magnet school where I was lucky to, get access to things like Next computers. And my dad worked overnight shifts and so did my mom, so they can buy me an Apple IIc. I remember that was my first computer, a little green screen. And that changed my life. And never looked back. I've always been excited about science and research and technology and innovation since I was a kid.
Yeah. And there's something I think really kind of special about immigrants that are highly educated, very successful in other countries, and they come to the United States. And I think that you've said in previous interviews that your father started off as a cab driver.
Yeah.
right? And there's this element of humility that goes along with I have to start over, or at least rebuild a life. And I always, laugh and kind of tell friends, Americans discount that, but Americans don't realize there's very few Americans who would do the opposite, right? Leave America, go somewhere else, and kind of be able to start over again. They don't kind of have some of that humility. And it's an overgeneralization. There's plenty of people who could do it, but for the most part, I think that that's a discounted part of kind of the immigrant story. Is it takes a lot to swallow your pride and go from, what sounds like high levels of government and kind of success to driving a cab, right? And kind of rebuilding from scratch.
Every American is an immigrant at some point, right? In their bloodlines. Every one of us came here. And if you go back thousands of years, Native Americans came here. They migrated here as well. And so, the American story is an immigrant story from the beginning. It's a story of immigrants. It's a story of bravery and courage. Wherever you look at, the first Americans to settle, or you look at later generations of Italians and Greeks and Irish and everyone that had to come here and wasn't welcome in some circles. There were signs saying no Irish need apply, right? Every immigrant group, Jewish and so on, Arab and so on, and Persian has had to come here and bootstrap from the beginning, no matter what generation they came here. And I think that's what really bonds the American identity. Everyone still has that. Everyone, whether your family came here 200 years ago, right, or 5 years ago, that is part of the ethic of what it means to be an American. So I think that's really what unites us more than divides us. And that's why I think entrepreneurship, and I wrote about this years ago. I was in Romania chasing a really an amazing developer who had developed a graphics engine for the iPhone back in like 2008, 2009 that enabled us to do multiplayer games over 3G. Apple hadn't even enabled that yet, and this young guy had figured that out. So I flew to Romania and never been before, and met him, closed a deal, and we launched the most advanced 3D graphics engine and game on the iPhone. And when I was out there, I wrote about entrepreneurship, and I realized at the time, as I met this young developer, that the American story had become global, that entrepreneurship had become global, that Silicon Valley wasn't a physical place anymore. It was a mentality. It was an idea, and had gone viral. And I knew at that moment, this was like 2008, 2009. I knew at that moment that the world was going to accelerate by the energy of that virality of entrepreneurship. That the American story had inspired. And, and one of the things I realized is that we could be left behind, right, by that momentum if we didn't keep up. And that's where, entrepreneurs like Travis or Elon and others who are builders, as Mark Andreessen, rightly talked about, it's time to build. This is a time for builders. This is a call to arms for builders. We can re-architect, rebuild everything, whether it's our currencies, our financial systems, our health systems, our medical systems, our government systems, all of the above is up for grabs, is up for people with talent and ability and drive and will and passion and love to work and build incredible things. Today, as we speak, SpaceX is going to launch the first astronauts on their rockets. And that is a momentous achievement. This is a private company that is now building the bridge for us to become an interplanetary species, which is Elon's goal. And that's the ultimate in terms of building, right? He's talking about building a whole new world, a new planet. And it sounds crazy, but I would never bet against Elon.
So you've obviously spent a good amount of time with him. And I think that one of the pieces that to me is very obvious is he, one, is misunderstood. Two, because he is so ambitious and believes so deeply that he and his team can drive so much innovation, it's an easy target to attack, both in the media, in private, etc. Maybe help us understand a little bit, as you've actually spent time with him, like what are your takeaways and kind of how do you evaluate both him as a person, but also to kind of those ambitions across SpaceX, Tesla, and then maybe we can get into some of the Hyperloop stuff after that.
Yeah. Well, my experience has been, incredibly meaningful. We've had some experiences like traveling together to Tahrir Square. He saw a trip that I did to Tahrir Square in the middle of the revolution, and then I went to Libya in the middle of the revolution. Same trip with Sean Penn, and we met with the rebels in Benghazi as they had liberated, like 2 weeks before Gaddafi was killed, and it was an incredible experience. And he was like, look, next trip you take like that, I want to go with you. And I was like, well, we're thinking about going to Cuba. And there was an American who was in prison for 8 years there. And we were like, maybe we can help with that. And so we're basically doing hostage negotiations, as Elon likes to tell it. And, we coordinated in terms of what our goals were, and said, and also the idea of like, helping to bring internet to the island. And we knew that bringing connectivity and communication to a country can really open things up. And so that was the trip, and it took 6 months to get the approvals. And Elon's jet was the second American plane to land in Cuba in 50 years. And so we landed there, and we met with ministers, and we met with university students. We, met with, Castro's son, with artists. And one of the things we said is like, look, you've got to release this American. There's nothing to talk about if you don't. And within a year, they released him, and then Obama opened up Cuba, and Rolling Stones came in for a free concert to 500,000 people. I mean, it affected change, right? And in that trip, and Elon said that was his favorite trip at the time, we started talking about on the plane, we started talking about Hyperloop. And I remember, everything kind of very clearly. And I remember saying, look, what are you going to do with it? This was an idea. The paper wasn't written. And what he said was, look, he's got 5 boys, SpaceX, Tesla, Solar City. He's super busy, and he didn't have time to do it. And he wanted to open source it anyway. So I said, do you mind if I try to, create a company around it? And he was like, no, go ahead. And my idea was, I didn't want to just do people transport. I wanted to revolutionize the idea of logistics, cargo, and commerce. And the idea was, imagine if you could order something, right, online, and it begins to be manufactured in real time, manufactured, distributed, and delivered all within 48 to 72 hours from anywhere in the world. Imagine that kind of real-time pulse to the global economy. And he was like, that's a really good idea, and I don't see any technical reason why you couldn't do people and cargo. So that was a business model, and I started to work on it. And one of the things to Elon is, one, he's an absolute genius. Two, he is incredibly loyal. I mean, he's a family person. He loves his family. He loves his close friends, and he's incredibly loyal to those people and to his teams that are building these incredible companies with him. And I saw multiple examples of that. And it was just, in every experience. There's a reason why people build great things with leaders and visionaries like that. They are inspired. They're inspired to do something more with their lives and to contribute something to the advancement of our world. There's nothing better than waking up in the morning and realizing all these years of work that you're sending two human beings into space on a private rocket. Like, come on. How cool is that?
Look, if you see the kind of hype video, if you will, that NASA and SpaceX released today, I mean, you watch this thing and you're like, again, I tweeted it a couple times. I don't know how you bet against these people, right? Whether it's Elon, whether it's the SpaceX team, whether it's NASA, just the fact that they have worked. And the part I actually wrote about this morning was, this isn't something that they started working on 2 years ago, right? I mean, we're talking almost 20 years he's been working on this problem, and it started from a first principles standpoint. I got to fix this rocket technology, get the cost down. I have to kind of get cargo, and then I can get people. And this is a multi-decade type body of work that we're just now starting to see, I think, where people say, hey, wait, they actually may pull this off, right? But it's 20 years in the making. Yeah.
I mean, everyone is praying for the safe journey of the astronauts. That's incredibly important, obviously, to their families and to the movement of humanity expanding beyond our planet. I was telling that story of having a conversation with Elon in 2012 about astronauts going on in his rockets. And we were going to the opening ceremony of the Olympics in 2012, and we got stuck in traffic. We were going to be late, and we saw some bikes for rent. So we jumped out of the car and rented the bikes and biked and made it. But then my leg cramped as we were walking, running, and he put his arms around, supported me to walk to a bench, and then ran and got water because I was dehydrated, obviously. And we sat down and we talked, and I asked him about, when do you think humans will go on your rocket? And he was so thoughtful. His number one concern was the safety of the astronauts. That's all he was concerned about. He was projecting 2023, I think, and he beat that. But that was his paramount concern, nothing else. He wasn't trying to rush to get there and risk, anyone's life. And there's always some risk, no matter what you do. But it's also an important reminder that, look, we put humans on the moon in the 60s, right? I mean, wow. I mean, and Kennedy got up there and said, wanting to put a man on the moon within the decade. And they did it. And they did it with computers with the power of a calculator today. And it's an incredible achievement. But we should also understand that it wasn't just an engineering achievement. It was a financial achievement and decision. I think the numbers I saw once, I wrote about this once, about the actual in kind of 1960s dollars that they committed to fund putting a man on the moon within the decade was something like $250 billion, right? And it was something like 4 or 5% of the GDP at the time. And that's an incredible commitment and achievement. And so it's like, look, we've already done this. we have these skills. A private company hasn't done it. Our government and our people did it, but companies have that skill as well. And it's another area where I talk about companies becoming, almost like sovereigns, right? I call them mini sovereigns. And, Tim Cook of Apple has the power, and Apple has the power and financial power of a nation state. Amazon and Bezos, same thing. Google, right? And imagine in the SpaceX example, if Elon pulls it off and he colonizes Mars in the next 20, 30 years and begins to seed humanity there, which is absolutely his goal. Again, it sounds crazy, but that is his goal. And every crazy idea he's had, guess what? He did it. From PayPal to, to SpaceX, to Tesla, to Solar City, and so on. So, like you said, I wouldn't bet against that.
Yeah, another founder that you spent a bunch of time with, who I think has very similar qualities, is obviously Travis and Uber. Maybe tell the story of when did you first meet Travis, and kind of when did you become aware of Uber as a company and start looking at it?
Yeah, I became aware of Uber super early when it had launched, and I was a fan, and I was trying to get in touch with her. I didn't know him at the time, so this was probably like 2010-ish. And it coincided with me becoming a venture capitalist for the first time. So that opportunity came to me in like, I started June 2011. And I chased Uber and a number of other companies that I thought were going to be massive companies like Airbnb and others. And Travis was notoriously hard to get in touch with. He wasn't going to answer some VC's email, right? So I had to, and he said this he said this before. He was like, I had to respond to Shervin because I basically had everyone in his network who I knew and knew well vouch for me. So they started saying to him like, "Hey, you should talk to Shervin." And I'm talking about swarming, not like one person or two person, like, and it was everyone from like Julius Januszowski, who was later the head of the FCC, to Drew Houston from Dropbox, to the list goes on. And so he did, he finally responded. And I had told another friend of mine who was an investor in Uber that, and on the board, I was like, look, if they ever raise money, let me know, or decide to raise money. And so he did me a favor the day of that board meeting. He called me and he said, hey, we're going to raise a new round. And this is when Uber was, I think, this was probably August, September of 2011. Uber is probably doing about $1.8 million in net revenue, had about 6,000 or 7,000 cars, drivers on it. Most of that was San Francisco. And like New York was like 1,200 cars. Like, it was tiny. So I started chasing it, and I was in the race. I was hustling, I was doing everything I can to win. And I got beat by another firm that I respect a lot, but Travis didn't. He called me and he was like, hey homie, that's exactly what he was like. He's like, I really like you. I wanted to go with you, but I have to go with this other firm. And I took it real cool. I was like, I totally understand, because as an entrepreneur, I get it. Sometimes you have to make that call. And so I said to him, congratulations. I'm happy for you. I totally understand. If anything goes wrong in the diligence or anything else, I want you to know that I'm like 110,000% behind you. So you negotiate with strength, because you've got a backup. And he was like, I appreciate that. And that was it. And then I was giving a keynote in like Tunisia for President Obama's whole entrepreneurship thing in the Middle East. And I got a call on my cell phone, and it was Travis. And luckily the signal was there. I picked up, and he was like, "Hey, you remember what you told me?" I was like, "Yeah." He was like, "Is that still on?" I was like, "Absolutely." He was like, "Can you meet me in Dublin?" There was this founders conference. So I got on the next plane, landed, hit the streets of Dublin, had a pint with him in a Irish pub. And as we were walking kind of the cobblestone streets at night, he told me his full vision that time. And it was, I'm not a taxi company. I want to replace car ownership, right? And suddenly the TAM, or the total addressable market, became, trillions. It wasn't, and that's the mistake my competition made, is they were comparing Uber to a black car company or a taxi company. And those comps are totally different than a technology platform, marketplace that could also expand into many other areas like transportation, food, and so on. And so that night, we agreed on a valuation. It was 290 million, and people thought we were crazy. Me and my firm were crazy for giving that valuation. But I went to his, I printed it out at the business center in the hotel, went to his, knocked on his door, and I have a picture of us signing the term sheet at the door. And we ended up putting, 26.5 million at 290. So about 8% of the company. And it turned out to be a great investment. And Travis and I became very close. I would say, one, super intelligence, right? Like Travis, Elon are in that category, like top 10 that I've met. Grit, like real grit, incredible willpower, just constantly thinking and working. And they're both incredible recruiters. Absolutely. I mean, some of the best recruiters I've ever seen. Travis spends a lot of time recruiting, and you look at what he did with Uber, and then you look at what he's doing with his current company in the cloud kitchen space, and he's recruiting like crazy. He's, and he's building a great company again, and he's right again, right? He's absolutely right about the trend, and he's building a really, really important part of that vision, and and that takes that kind of incredible drive and commitment.
And so when you get that phone call, you go to Dublin, how much negotiating is there versus, Travis, tell me what you want, and we're in because we believe in you specifically, and we have this kind of deep-seated belief that you're going to build a successful company, and the terms today don't matter as much. Like, is it something where you guys are literally sitting down and it's every single term is getting negotiated? Or is it more of, what I call like the Warren Buffett deal, where he says, hey, look, basically I know if I'm going to do, multi-billion-dollar deal in the first 5 minutes on the phone. Right. And yeah, I got to figure out the details, but I pretty much know quickly. Like, how did that actually go down?
Yeah, I think, the other firm that had won initially tried to reprice the deal, which, if you know Travis, you just don't do that. And, I didn't know Travis that well, but my instinct already was, don't mess with that. Like, if you give your word, keep it. And I'm a person of my word. Like, if I give my word, I follow through. And that's why also a key part of why we became so close, because we knew, like, when you're dealing with someone where there's no artifice, right? Elon is exactly the same way. There is no tricks. They don't need to. Tricks are for people who have a reason to do the trick, right? To get some advantage. But if you work incredibly hard and you're super intelligent, you don't need to rely on tricks. You just build, right? And so we bonded because we knew when we were speaking to each other, there was zero artifice in what we said. We meant it. And if we were wrong about what we believed at the time, we were open to being convinced that we were wrong and then move on. And I saw that in him. Like, he might disagree with you violently, you know, or I might disagree violently, but then, you know, after hashing through all the logic, one of us would come out the other side agreeing with the other if we weren't agreeing in the first place. So I think that's part of it. So I think we got lucky too that we were in that situation where there was that repricing. So I remember offering 290 over text because I went to like work on a term sheet, talk to my team, and then, you know, I think the iPhone had just come out with the little bubble thing, you know. But so I sent it, and then I was waiting for him to respond, no bubble, right? And, you know, like, oh crap, like, I'm like, is he negotiating against me with somebody else, you know, or with the same firm, using my offer to, like, you know, get a better deal? But, you know, that whole thing about keeping your word, you know, luckily he came back. And before he came back, I remember increasing the offer. I was like, 295, you know, because I got nervous. And he was like, no, I mean, that's cool. We'll stick to 299. And I think 290. And then, you know, it was the first time I think Travis has ever agreed to a lower price on his own. You know, so we went with 290.
Yeah. And so what's really interesting is Travis, Elon, there's many other examples in history, is these folks are all able to go across industries, right? Obviously, Elon, there's similarities between space launching, electric vehicles, solar city, whatever, but the most common aspect of those three companies is Elon, right? When you look at Travis with Uber, Cloud Kitchens,
yep.
Travis. And so how much of these investments and the building of the companies is dependent just on who's driving the company versus picking the right markets or, you know, actually building the right products? Like, you've invested in so many companies at this point. You know, there's the argument that some people are founder investors, some are market and some are product. Like, where do you come out on that framework, and what do you actually look for when you're making these investments?
Yeah, I was telling the story that my daughter, when she was 11, I took her to her favorite sushi place, and she was like, "Dad, how do you invest? You know, what do you do?" And I looked at her and I said, you know, I call it the love principle. Like, you have to love the founder, the team, the product, the market, right? And if you don't love any one of those things, probably not a good investment. And she looks up at me and she's like, "Well, I love Great America." And it was true. She would go there every weekend. We'd always go for Halloween haunts, and I was like, "Okay, so you love Great America. Like, here's what you have to do. You have to go there and interview and do what's called diligence. Interview the employees, get insights." And she did that. She came back. She was like, "Dad, all the employees like love the company. They love the CEO. The company's called Cedar Fair. The 49ers are doing $1 billion stadium there." And I was like, there you go. So Cedar Fair is a public company. That's your first investment. So she made 100% return, and she's starting her own company now at 19. And when she was 18, she started it. And, you know, she learned a really important lesson. She's using the profits from that investment that she did when she was 11 to start this company. But I tell that story because that is exactly how I invest. Like, those are the four quadrants. And if I have any kind of, you know, qualitative or quantitative reason not to believe in one of those things, I'm not going to do the investment. And for whatever reason, that's been working. I'm up about 73x since 2011, which is amazing. Like, first of all, I never thought I was going to be a venture capitalist investor. You know, I'm an immigrant kid, poor kid. Like, I didn't think that was possible. And I was surprised when I started getting those, you know, offers and opportunities. And so that formula is something, you know, that is qualitative and quantitative. And some people are really good at the quantitative and some people are really good at the qualitative. if you're good at both, I think you can go in the pantheon of great investors in terms of track record and also in terms of just reputation amongst founders. I think what you said about Elon and Travis is absolutely right. Like, we look for great founders, right, that are building industries. Like, one of the things I say is, like, build industries, don't just build companies. And, you know, that is an interesting juxtaposition in terms of some of the fissures you're seeing in the venture capital world versus, you know, founders. Founders are amazing founders, have a lot of opportunity to get funding, and also can be picky and choosy. And when you're not picky and choosy, you end up with bad investors on your board, on your cap table, and it is a nightmare. We've lived through things like that, and it can be an absolute nightmare. And so, you know, if you look at like Elon's story, like, there were venture capitalists that when he needed the money in December, in that 60 Minutes interview where he, you know, had tears talking about that moment where he thought that his companies were going to die, right? That he had worked so hard and he put every dollar that he had into those companies to save them. And he was living at his friends' homes and didn't have a house and was basically homeless, working on these companies, having put every dollar that he made on PayPal and his other startup as a mapping company that he had started in his early 20s. And so he took that kind of bold risk. And, you know, I think a couple of the VCs, especially one, bowed out, you know, at the last minute. And Elon, like, had to rescue the company. And I don't think he ever forgot that, right? I don't think he never wanted to be in that position again, where his company could get killed. I think Travis has gone through similar types of journeys, and, you know, he's working on his company. I don't think there is a VC on that cap table, right? And so I think what's going to happen is great founders like Travis and others are going to fund other great founders. And founders are going to become more careful, right? If they have the luxury of choice, they're going to be careful about who and what firms and what angels, what investors they bring in. Because if you bring a psychopath into your company, you know, if you bring a, you know, someone that schemes against the company for whatever reason, it can kill a company. It can destroy billions of dollars of value and also hold back progress for humanity, especially with these types of founders. So it's an interesting branch of investing in entrepreneurship, which is there aren't that many of these types of founders, right? And I have the thesis that as entrepreneurship spreads and goes viral, that we're going to find the Elons of Africa, the Travises of South America, right? Like, we're going to find the undiscovered Edisons that are out there that have that talent, but opportunity hasn't come to them because opportunity wasn't democratized. And that's where we're at now. And if you think about the next 20 years, the next 40 years, you know, people say disruption, but that doesn't really cover what's happening. The speed at which these innovations are coming are getting exponentially faster. Look at, you know, blockchain and Bitcoin and what's happening. These are, to me, systemic bets, long-term systemic bets on the future of humanity. And when you back someone like Elon, or you know, or you buy and invest in Bitcoin, these are two different types of asset classes, but they're long-term systemic bets on the future of humanity. And I'm into systemic bets. Those are massive bets. Those are like TAMs, you know, squared. You know, what's the total addressable market of a planet, of a new world, of a new civilization. Like what, right? And so if you think that big and you think intergenerationally, if you think beyond your own life in terms of your investments, whether you're investing for your family, institution, yourself, and so on, you have to think long term.
And it strikes me that once you see one or two of these work, you almost become emboldened, right? So if you had never seen SpaceX or Tesla or Uber or any of these companies actually play out, you almost become more risk averse. But when you see them work, you then start to think that way, right? You get that feedback loop of, hey, I actually want those market expanding technologies. I want those founders who can think intergenerationally. And so maybe talk a little bit about, like, because you have been so close to some of these founders who, you know, will go down as the best founders of our lifetime, right? It's kind of where this is headed. And these companies end up being industry defining companies. How has that changed the types of companies that you invest in since you've been close to those people and those companies?
That's a great question. As you were asking the question, I was thinking about it almost as 100% that fear is what keeps people. Fear is what de-risks people's potential, right? And so they in their mind, when you make a little bit, right? And I remember when I made my first little bit of liquidity, and I called my dad, and I was like, you know, it was like, you know, it was the first time I ever had any liquidity, and it was like, I don't know, about $4 million. And this is like going from like nothing to like, whoa, I just sold a company, I got $4 million. Wow. And I had never felt what fuck you money was until that moment. I couldn't understand it. There's no way you understand it until you have it. I swear. It is a liberation of the soul, right? And because at that point you can walk away. Greatest negotiators have the leverage to walk away from the negotiating table, right? And at the negotiating table of life, if you don't have that leverage, you're trapped and you're willing to compromise beyond your comfort levels, right? But when you have that fuck you money, it becomes a liberation point. I called my dad and I was like, Dad, this is what it feels like. I didn't know what that felt like, right? And guess what? I put every dollar that I made into Uber, right? So that was the right thing to do because, you know, that's another 400x on top, you right? Like, so that was the right bet, but I was willing to kind of risk it all, put all the chips on one thing, and it could have gone really badly, but it didn't, right? And then it's like, oh, do I risk it again, right? Do I make that bet again? And that's where someone like Elon that took every dollar and put it all into SpaceX and Tesla and Solar City, that he didn't have that fear, right? So the antidote to fear is exactly what you're talking about, is that if you become attuned to the possibility of a massive bet that you believe in and you're passionate about, that's when you're willing to forget your fear. It gives you kind of antibodies, right? Makes you immune to that fear. And if you're willing to take a big systemic, you know, bet, it can turn out great. And it has in those cases.
Yeah, you obviously have been right multiple times, and I've asked Chamath, I've asked Mark Cuban, and a couple of others. What were you doing when you realized that you had $1 billion? right? So Mark Cuban said he knew exactly how much stock he had. He was sitting, he was just refreshing and refreshing. And then he described it as he went and did a naked dance, right? He was so excited. It's a little bit different, I think, with the venture capital side where everything's illiquid and it doesn't track kind of a stock price. So kind of what was that, for you, like, do you remember what you were doing? And then two, mentally, you talk about kind of the unshackling, right? And you almost, it seems like can enter into a different mindset of what can I actually invest in? What do I want to spend my time doing? Maybe talk a little bit about, going from nothing to 4 million is kind of, it seems like one level, then going from 4 million to a billion plus is a whole nother level and almost like another level to the game, if you will.
The thing I'm proudest of is that these investments have returned billions of dollars to a lot of LPs that are retirement funds of our grandparents and nonprofits that are doing really good work in the world. Like that, like my measure of billions is not what I'm acquiring, but how I'm contributing to the cycle of giving, right? And helping to fund these incredible institutions and nonprofits, pension funds that are the livelihood of humanity, that put bread on the table of people's, in people's homes. And so that to me is the most important part. And one of the things I've noticed is none of the great founders ever really gave a shit about money. Like once you kind of like that 4 million, that was the taste. It didn't make a difference if it was 4 million or a billion or 500 million or 300 million or whatever. It happens once. It doesn't matter wherever it was it's that moment, the mental switch, the unshackling, right, of your mind and the opening up to the possibility that you can do not just a 10x, but 100x, right? And in some cases, thousands of X in terms of impact. And one of my good friends, Peter Diamandis, one of the things he talks about is, the true billionaire is about having an impact on 1 billion people. In a positive one, not a negative one. And we see some great founders who build products that are inherently flawed in the impact they have on humanity. I love Facebook, but I haven't been on Facebook for 5 or 6 years. And we've seen the impact it's had systemically. And I believed in the early days of like the positive impact, but I think from a policy perspective, and now we're going through similar types of things with other platforms. But we have to get ahead of those things. You have to manage those products so that you continue to have positive impact at scale.
How do you think about that balance for a platform? So take Facebook, right? I worked there in 2014 and 15, and there was always this balance, I think, even internally, of connecting the world is a great mission, right? And there's lots of kind of net positive aspects of that. It doesn't come without challenges, though, right? And we've seen that everything from on the election side and kind of all of that stuff to other aspects like just terrorist content can get shared and communication between bad actors and all of that. And so how do you think through that balance for platforms? And do you get to a point where you almost have to accept that there's some negative impact, but it's a net positive, and so we should kind of continue to encourage these? Or do you see it as, hey, we should work tirelessly to eliminate any negative impact and only focus on promoting the positive aspect? Like, how do you mentally break that down?
Well, I think part of it is when you're generating tens of billions of dollars of profit off a platform like that, you become trapped to the engine of profit, right? And it blurs the lines of right and wrong, because you might make a decision that is wrong ethically, but is right for your profits. And that's not that's the conundrum. And when you're at that kind of scale, where you have a massive part of humanity on the platform, the impact it can have is it can change, sway elections. It can, lead to genocides and violence and all these things. And, it's unfortunate because in the beginning, the reason why I went to Egypt and Libya in the middle of those revolutions is I was inspired by people like Hemingway, who went to the Spanish Civil War, and actually he fought. I didn't fight. I went to observe and learn, and it was still scary, right? And but back then I was like, I wrote essays about this, that I said, the last bastion of dictatorship is the router, right? And we have to figure, if dictators can control the router, they can basically, they can shut off the internet, the mobile, which is exactly what happened in places like Libya and Egypt. But back then, the impact of Twitter and Facebook on those movements was very positive. So I was an optimist about it. And I think the reason why Chamath and me and others have been persuaded that it's having an overwhelmingly negative impact is that something happened in between at that kind of scale, where the moral compass became blurred. And so, it's fixable. It's just a matter of will. And sometimes, a company has to decide that it has to fundamentally change some things. And that might mean short-term or medium-term, even long-term compression of the profits. But overall, it will lead to a healthier ecosystem within which to continue to scale.
Yeah, and then on these platforms, we've seen a complete rise of what I'll call kind of a new generation of creators, right? And you've tweeted quite a bit about this, what I'll just call the creator class, right? Yep. And so a number of tweets that you've had, I just love, where you're like, look, Joe Rogan's a billionaire, Kylie's a billionaire. And this creator class is, some will call it new media, some will call it kind of influence or the influencer economy. But it's definitely something that wasn't there in the size, scope, or mechanism that it is today, even 10 years ago, right? And so maybe talk a little bit about like what is drawing your attention to that, and how do you view that creator class kind of in the world order, if you will, of what we're seeing happen?
Yeah, great question. I mean, so I started going down to LA in like 2008. I had SGN, Social Gaming Network. So it was one of the first gaming companies, social gaming companies on Facebook platform, and then on the iPhone. And, on the iPhone, 1 in 4 iPhones had one of our games. And we merged that company with a company called MindJolt, and that's Jam City now. So they're doing it like $500 million on the in revenue on the iPhone now. And so I was going down to LA, and I was meeting with people in that world, in the entertainment world. And I remember like back then, I was saying like, hey, bring Lost to the Facebook platform as a social game. And, it was hard to convince people to take those kinds of bets, right? Because of that same conservative type thinking about platforms and taking that kind of risk. But it was absolutely the right call to do, right? Same pitch on the iPhone and so on. And then when I started investing, I started talking to friends of mine down there that I was having those discussions, and I was trying to build bridges between Silicon Valley and LA. And some people got in, some people were like, I want 20% of the company. And I was like, sorry, like that's not going to happen. That's not how it works. You've got to put some money into it. You got, invest just like everybody else and help the company. But you're not getting 20%. And so we helped change the culture down there to an investor class culture, right? To, shareholder culture versus like, I'm me and I deserve 20%. So that was important. And so, conversations and meeting people like, Jay Brown and Jay-Z or Troy Carter or Scooter Braun or, Adam Lieber and Ari Emanuel, and bringing them into Uber, like those were the ones that got it, invested, and made a great return on their investment with us into Uber, right? And helped the company a lot and all of that. But then I think the legend of those investments is what changed the culture in LA, because the people who passed that I talked to, who I won't name right now, but they were kicking themselves. They were like, what was I thinking? Why didn't I put in that $250,000 check and get a 400x return or whatever? And, it ended up being. So it's, that's one. Then between 2008 and now in 2020, the evolution that's happened is that people now, the influencer and the founders and the people are the brand, are the company. And, companies can live and die. But an influential person, whether it's a founder and an entertainer and so on, anyone that has an audience that's loyal and spends time with them, similar to how you do, or Rogan does, and others do, have a chance to build something that impacts billions of people and makes them billionaires, right? And so the power, especially in terms of the new media paradigm, is that, these influencers who are also great entrepreneurs can build incredible value for themselves, their families, their employees, their teams, and so on, and investors, faster than at any other time in history.
What's driving that? Is that a technology inflection point? Is that a just mindset? People now are thinking there's a different way to monetize this or build these companies? Or is there something else that's driving it?
It's the death of the middleman. Just like the death of the salesman. The middleman was a remnant of a different world. And all of the people that were in between these influencers and the audience, and not just people, but companies, all of the agencies and the management companies and all these other things that were in the middle taking a cut. Even the lawyers in LA get a cut of everything someone makes. It's insanity. It's, a form of slavery. And so, I'm not going to get a lot of love from lawyers in LA, but I mean, it does make, when I found out the lawyers get a percentage, like, agents and management, I was like, why? Like, pay their fees and move on. But that was the mentality and the culture, which then in turn made people desperate and overestimating their worth and saying, I want 20% of the company, when it's like, no. Invest, make a great, amazing return, and learn how to be a founder and build your own company. So I think it's that collapse and compression where the influencer and their audience became one, right? Like, it's that trend that we just saw where the young lady created a cult, right? The step chickens or whatever it's called. I think that's hilarious, right? But it's a genius move because she realized that if she could collapse the audience and she becomes the audience and the audience becomes her, and suddenly she's a platform, and suddenly the audience and the fans are a platform in unison, right? United. And look what they did. Overnight, top of the charts, put out an app, the ranking goes up. All the comment streams of all these influencers, suddenly same profile picture. Genius, right?
What it reminds me a lot of is the old model was, let's build a product or a service and then go spend a bunch of time, money, and resources to find the customers or the audience. right? So it's kind of company first, audience and customers second. Now, though, that's inverting, right? Actually, what's happening is people are building the audiences first, and then they're basically going back to the drawing board and say, okay, I've got this massive audience of hundreds of thousands or millions of people. What do I build to serve them? Is it a mobile app? Is it a merchandise store? Is it some other product, like a Kylie Jenner or whatever? And to me, that almost feels like if you can build the audience, it's actually a great way to de-risk the company building, right? Because you know that there's an audience there. And so you're drastically increasing the probability of the product market fit in the future.
The product market fit is the person. The brand is the person. And I mean, talk about reducing CAC, right? The customer acquisition cost. If you have an audience and you can do what Joe did and what Daniel Ek just did together, that's the beginning of the end of any kind of middleman in the media world. And we already have experienced that in the tech world, where the Elons and Travises can create, incredible world-changing companies on their own and then back others like them, all right? Or the Kylie can create $1 billion company and she's 22, 23 years old. Or Kanye can take his genius and design a shoe in Yeezy and create a 3 billion plus company with his creativity, right? And so I think, that's a trend it's not going away. It's here. And I think, this new wrinkle, what it kind of inspired me around thinking through is ephemeral influencers, right? Like, she might suddenly show up with, a cult, right? And suddenly have 1 million people following and being the platform, and it might go away, and that's okay, So it made me think of kind of like the Andy Warhol quote of everyone's going to have 15 minutes of fame, right? I think it's, in this case, everyone's going to have $15 million, right? It's like she might make $15 million, right? And that's a life-changing amount for her and her family. But because she was creative about something and she basically created a new form factor within other platforms, a platform within a platform, and it might be ephemeral and go away, and that's okay.
Yeah, and it feels like it's becoming more and more obvious every day as the more redundant, kind of minute activities are getting automated away, and software's replacing a lot of that work. The creative side of this is just getting exponentially more valuable, right? And we're kind of seeing that just explode. And so something like the Step Chickens cult, which is hilarious that literally the New York Times is writing about it, but they're writing about it because it's real, right? Yeah. And it has serious audience, serious influence. We'll probably see 1,000 more of those over the coming years.
Absolutely. And here's to not just that, but here's to having 1,000 Elons bloom, 1,000 Travises, 1,000 Steve Jobs, and I think that's that all of it. Like, everyone should rise, and anyone that wants to be an entrepreneur has the opportunity to do that. And there's no middleman left, and all of the most expensive parts of building these components continue to drop over time. And I think we've learned a lot of lessons over the last 10 years of capital is not a guarantor of success or scale. Just because you have $1 billion to spend doesn't mean you have $1 billion of scale. Those are two very different things.
I won't name names, but we've seen a couple of companies raise a lot of money and they don't go anywhere, right? And usually they raise that money before they ever launch a product, and so that ends up can almost hurt you more, right, than actually just building the product to begin with. Before we wrap up, I want to talk about outside of tech investing, what else are you investing in, or what else are you excited about, either before kind of the coronavirus pandemic or now as we're seeing some of the economic shocks? Like, how are you thinking about the rest of your portfolio or your investing activities?
Um, we care a lot about that as a family because we came from nothing, and we have to give back. And my children, I have two kids, and they care a lot about giving back as well, and so does my nephews and niece, and so we have them all involved. I'm lucky that my sister Sarah is head of the family foundation, the Pishevar Family Foundation, called PI, like PI, and then we're trying to bring the same kind of systemic thinking, but also, innovation to what we're doing. So as an example, in this, crisis and pandemic, early on, I kind of latched on to the idea of using 3D printers and laser cutters to basically 3D print, face masks and shields and so we kind of created a movement to do that called Health OS, and we partnered with IRI Foundation and others, and we've now, I think the numbers, like we've delivered like something like 20,000 made and are delivering 20,000 face shields to hospitals here in Florida, in New York, in Mexico, and other places, and we're continue to scale that. And it's been a really cool project, and Sarah's been helping scale that, and those are the kinds of ideas we like. We also did something called the Cyrus Prize to kind of find, young Iranian Americans who are, incredibly smart and are working on big ideas, and giving out a $100,000 prize to them.
That's awesome. Before I end, I always ask the same two questions to everybody. The first being, what's the most important book you've ever read?
Wow, that's a great question. That's like asking you to choose your children, one over the other. I remember when I read Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad in my early teens, it blew my mind. I just remember what an impact it had. Same with Old Man and the Sea by Hemingway. Those are stories that never leave you, stretch your mind. So from a fiction perspective, I would pick, one of those. If you were to make me pick one, I'd say, Heart of Darkness. And then in terms of nonfiction, I would say, I read Burn Rate back in the 90s, and it had a huge impact on me. And, it always made me remember that story. And that cycle has repeated itself so many times, where people have raised a lot of capital and then forgot about their burn rate and burned too much capital and ran out. And capital is your oxygen, and talent is as well. So you have to keep those two things in tandem in your mind and get ahead of it, because you run out of both, you're dead.
Yeah, those are two great books. And then the last question, we spoke a bunch about SpaceX, but what about aliens? Believer, non-believer? How do you kind of think through whether there might be intelligent life out there?
That's a funny question. Back to some conversations with Elon in the early days. I remember talking to him well before everybody was talking about simulations, and we would go back and forth on it. And one of the insights was, I remember saying, like, given almost infinite time, everything that could have happened has already happened. So we're already living in the future. And, from a scientific perspective, I think that's it's a even weirder thing to say than to say aliens are real, but scientifically, it could work out. And what I mean by that is that if you have highly advanced AI and some kind of merger between biological life and AI, if that's the future, right? And if we're already living in that future, my insight was, that what would any advanced intelligence want to answer? And it's the fundamental question of, when I was a kid, I'd look up at the sky and be like, okay, everyone says God created this world. Well, who created God? And then I would black out like that, because that was such a scary thought, that there was nothing and then there was something. So I was like, look, an advanced intelligence would want to basically reverse engineer history through trillions of simulations. And we might be living in just one of those, stacked up against each other. And to them, it's a blink of an eye, right? And, the advanced intelligence would want mutants, would want people who experiment, who bend the universe, because it's the mutants and the different thinkers like the Steve Jobs or the Edisons and so on, who bend the fabric of the universe. And one of the things, people who have done that, in our experiences, I've seen this universally, when we try to bend the universe yields, right? And so, and it yields in the way it's supposed to yield. If you understand that, then it's a core generator of courage, and allows you to not be afraid. It's the antidote to the fear of taking risks. Because if the universe is going to yield, if you try, ultimately, and you fail and you keep trying, and you fail and you keep trying, and it works in the end, like Edison's light bulbs, he made 1,800 versions of it. So my long answer to you is yes, but a different kind of alien.
I love it. And look, I think ultimately it goes back to that unshackling of the mind, right? And if you're able to do that, it's incredibly powerful. If people want to learn more about the work you're doing or the investing you're doing, where can we send them to learn more?
They can go to Pishevar.com or Shervin.com, my first name or last name. And there's some info there. And, my email is just my name, Shervin@Pishevar.com.
Awesome. Well, listen, thank you so much.
The next Elon or Travis or Steve Jobs, let me know.
Don't say that on the internet. You're going to get a whole bunch of trolls along with maybe one that might be real.
No, obviously we can't answer every, but the swarming concept is a good one. Like, I emailed Travis, he didn't answer, but if you have people that I know, like you, that vouch for you, then the probability of, something happening and engagement and learning more is going to happen.
For sure. Well, listen,
and bend the universe.
I love it. Well, listen, thank you so much for doing this. I think people will get a ton out of this, and want to do it again in the future.
Really love your approach and framework of thinking.